So, good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to see such a big crowd here. This is absolutely fantastic. My name is Trish Mosser. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of a new initiative here at SIPA on central banking and financial policy. I'm very pleased to be co-sponsoring this talk by Alfonso Prat Gay, Argentina's Minister of Treasury and Public Finance. My co-sponsors today are OMFIF, the official monetary and financial institutions forum from the UK, and PEPM from SIPA. Minister Prat Gay has been a consultant, an international financial economist, a professor, a central banker, a politician, and a policymaker, and that's quite a resume. But the common theme across his career is a deep and abiding interest and expertise in international finance and financial policy. He's a recipient of numerous awards, including Best Economist of Chile and Argentina, Euromoney's Central Banker of the Year in 2004 after reducing inflation from over 40% to single digits in about somewhere between 12 and 18 months, I think. And most recently, Finance Minister of the Year. In recent years, he served in the National House of Representatives, including a stint as the chair of the Financial Committee there. He was appointed Minister of Treasury and Public Finance last December. As you are all very well aware, Argentina is going through a tremendous transition in the last year, implementing very significant policy, regulatory, and legal changes. The title of his talk sort of says it all, graduating from populism after one too many spring breaks. But we're tremendously pleased that he's here today to discuss these policy changes, their impacts, and their remaining challenges. After the minister's prepared remarks, Professor Guillermo Calvo of SIPA and David Marsh, the director of OMFIF, will start us off with a few questions of their own, hopefully provocative questions, and then we will open it up to the floor and let all of you ask some questions too. Minister, thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today on Columbus Day, of all days, on Columbia University. So congratulations to all of you. It's, as I say, it's an honor and a pleasure. And I thank the opportunity to the university, to SIPA, to OMFIF, to let us explain to you what we're trying to do right now in Argentina. Happy to see quite a few young faces around. I'm looking forward to your questions more than anyone else's. And the plan for the next 20 minutes, I believe, is for me to go through a PowerPoint presentation for the benefit of, thank you, some of you who are probably not too aware of what's been going on over the last 10 months or so. But we leave the best part for the living room when we're going to get questions from Guillermo and David and from the audience. And let's hope that we're going to make it as interactive as possible. As Trish was saying, the title probably says it all. Most of you who have read something about Argentina and came into this meeting are wondering, why is it going to be different this time around? Aren't you? You are. And this is something that we, of course, ask ourselves. And, of course, the answer is that it will be different. And hopefully I will have enough time to explain why we believe this time is going to be different. But if there's one takeaway that you would rather take away today is the following, before I get into the charts. When you look at this new administration, when you look at President Macri and his team, when you look at the finance team, which is getting kudos from the international community, don't think for a minute that that's the engine behind the change. The change is being driven not by us, but rather by the people. They voted for this change. They voted for putting an end to populism, despite the fact that most of them were, in a way, enjoying the benefits of populism. So change this time around is actually for real. And I would flip that around. If it doesn't happen, it's because we weren't able to make it happen, because we were not at the level that our people was asking us to be, because the demanding and the driving force for change is not this government, but our people. Let me say a thing or two about, you know, the starting line, where we found things when we came to government. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we need to spend some time on it for you guys to understand the size of some of the challenges that we've had to face from day one. It was quite an obvious thing for the world that the previous policies were unsustainable. Unfortunately, it was not that obvious for the previous administration. That's why they kept them to the limit. They were basically running out of reserves. We inherited a fiscal deficit that, depending on how you measure it or gauge it or look at it or whatever, is clearly north of 6 points of GDP. The economy had been stagnated for 5 years, not growing almost at all, with no growth on the labor market, and with very high inflation. Inflation averaging around 25% for around 5 years in a row. Usually inflation is an issue of overheated economies. This was quite the opposite, because the economy was not going anywhere. And the interesting thing is that any time in our history where you found the combination of these things, like an overvalued currency, a massive fiscal deficit, a closed economy, high inflation, no growth or little growth, the combination of all those things, usually in the case of Argentina and probably in any other experience, meant that you were going right into a financial, economic, and probably social crisis as well. And probably, see, I saved you of the other elements in the list. But probably the most important thing we've done since we took office was that we averted that crisis. I mean, the crisis was almost inevitable. And as I said before, it was not us who decided to put an end to that crazy ride on that train. We were asked to, stop that train in the tracks, turn around and avoid the inevitable crisis that would have meant not just hitting the wall again for Argentina, but another massive financial and social crisis. And let me remind you that the latest figures in Argentina show that 1 out of 3 Argentines are living under the poverty line. So a financial crisis would have meant a completely unsustainable social situation. And this was probably the most tricky and the most challenging thing that we were entrusted to do. And that so far is working actually quite well. We are, in fact, in the middle of the transition. 2016 was always going to be a transition year. You don't flip things around from night into day. It takes a while. And therefore we had to walk through a very narrow path. It was essentially a balancing act. That is the trademark or the footprint of every single policy that you see from us has to be or needs to be framed in this, very sensitive challenge. We know where we want to go, but we also very cognizant of the fact that, the starting point is a weak starting point. Therefore, this is where past and future meet, and the present has to be very cognizant of those constraints. Well, we've done quite a few things that I'll spare you off. I mean, we've eliminated all capital controls. We unified the exchange rate system. We put an end to the absurd discussion with creditors that was out there for too long and that was incredibly expensive for Argentina. We were able to negotiate with the holdouts despite the fact that they had a sentence, a firm sentence from the Supreme Court of the US. We knocked off around 40% of that claim just because we were credible in our discussions. Because of striking a deal in the New York courts, we were home free to accessing the international and I would argue the local market as well. And this was critical to everything else that we've done ever since. Have we not had access to credit, we would have had to cut spending or increase taxes to rein in the deficit. So it was critical to our gradualist approach to have had a deal with the holdouts. And we were successful in explaining that to Congress because we got congressional approval for something that early on didn't really look like we were going to get approval. And this was one of the issues. People were looking at Argentina and saying, well, how on earth are you going to do this? Well, we did it. And we did it much earlier than what most people would have expected. Monetary policy, the central bank is truly independent. It is now launching an inflation targeting regime. The central bank can count on that independence because, among other things, not just because the president is very convinced about this, but also because I've been a central banker myself, and I was happy to be considered an independent institution when I was there. So it's only fair that we do the same thing when we are across the street. Fiscal policy, we've got a fiscal program that is basically reducing the deficit across a number of years, and it's banking particularly in eliminating, not just reducing, but eliminating subsidies to the rich. I mean, that's something that sometimes we need to explain. It would make a whole debate in the US. I'm not going to get into the debate issue, of course, and the locker room discussion or whatnot. But we were a country that did two amazing things for a number of years. First, we taxed exports in a world where competition is about, everything, but we were putting an onus on exporters who wanted to compete with the rest of the world. And we were this country out of so many other countries that we were so fond of giving checks, paychecks away to the rich, because at least 50% of the fiscal spending on energy and transport subsidies that the previous administration went through ended up in the pockets of the 30% richest part of the population. So when you think about these guys are reducing subsidies, think about that. What we're doing is we're taking, subsidies away from the rich, and therefore, from a political point of view, that should be much easier to do than otherwise. Trade policy, there were lots of distortions, so we took care of to unleash the potential of the private economy. And also, we've got no problem with being transparent. The previous administration was hiding their numbers, not just hiding them, they were making them up. They completely destroyed the National Statistics Institute to the point that no one even paid attention to what the Statistics Institute would publish, because we all knew it was just simply not true. And therefore we had to revamp the index, the Statistics Institute. We are now in conversations with the IMF such that they are allowed to do what they do with every other member of the IMF club, which is every other year check out what's going on and write a report on it. How bad is that? You tell me. But we've got no problem with, having other opinions of what we're doing and what's going on. We don't need to pay attention and to listen to the recommendations of the IMF, but we've got no problem with the IMF having a view on what we're doing, and there's truly nothing to be hidden or nothing to hide. More importantly, we are increasing our ties with other institutions worldwide, like the OECD. We are members of the G20 group of nations that has become so important right after the financial crisis. We sit on that table. We are no longer part of the problem there. We want to be part of the solution. And as an homage to that, we've been appointed as the hosting country for the G20 meetings during 2018, right after Germany, who will, they will host the meetings next year, and China this year. As of next year, we'll be part of the Troika. The Troika is made up of the current, the past, and the upcoming host. So that is also very important for us. We've got friends from Australia coming over to Argentina to help. We've got our people who will be part of the German team to organize that as well. And we believe this is going to be a quite important event into 2018 for a number of reasons. Let's see what we've got here. Okay, I mentioned poverty rates. I mentioned that as well. I mentioned inflation. I did mention something about sequencing. Just when you look at us and you see all the goodwill and all the great plans and programs that we've got, before you get too excited and before you get carried away, spend some time looking at the sequencing, because we believe that the sequencing is basically the name of the game here. It's not too difficult. You don't need a PhD to know what we need to do, but the sequencing is where it could all end up, in success or in lack of success. These are the things that we've done. And essentially, there were some areas where we had to move very quickly in order to afford the not so quickly upcoming steps, which we call gradualism. Gradualism is the name of the game here. As it was mentioned before, when a few years ago, when we were at the central bank, we were able to bring inflation down from 40% to less than 4% in just 1 year. The conditions were different back then. This is a different game in town. We can't quite do that in 1 year, but we are pretty sure that we can do it in 3 or 4 years. And that's why we set up, the targets that by 2019 inflation will be around 5%, starting from 30%. And the flip side of that is our fiscal program. It started off at nearly 7% deficit. This year we had a target of 4.8%, and we're going to meet it. Next year we've got a target of 4.2%, which is already quite ambitious, given that it's an important political year because we've got midterm elections. And by the end of the mandate, we're shooting for around 1.5% primary deficit, which is much better than pretty much 75% of the countries in the emerging market world. So it is ambitious in itself. There you have it. Those are the targets. I didn't lie to you. It's what they are. Let me say a word or two about inflation. This is, sadly enough, this is monthly inflation. We wish it was annual inflation. We will eventually get there. But, the red bars are the utility component of inflation, or rather the non-component, because, as I mentioned before, the previous administration was just giving away energy and transport pretty much for free. When we took office, just for you to get a sense, residential electricity was worth around 10% of the average cost. So 90% of the bill was actually given away to, as I said before, mostly to wealthy families and homes. The same was true about gas, and more or less the same, even worse, about transportation. So along the way, when we look at inflation, we'll have to take into account the fact that there's a component of inflation that is own-made. We decided that we're going to eliminate the distortions there. So that's one element to this chart. But basically, the most important thing is that when you look at that chart, what you take away is three things. First, there was a spike in inflation at the beginning of the year, both because of the tariff situation, but also because of removing FX controls and unifying the exchange rate. We knew that would happen. We were hoping and we were very convinced that it was going to be short-lived. We promised that it was going to be short-lived. Most journalists made a lot of fun out of that because we promised that things would get better in the second half of the year. And things did get better in the second half of the year. So now they have to make fun of other stuff rather than what we promised and what we complied with. And that chart actually shows you that. That's the second thing. You know, the gray bar has fallen quite significantly at the beginning of the second half of the year. And the green lines there are the targets we had set ourselves beforehand. Again, these are monthly rates. We were hoping for inflation to fall below 2% by September. It was already less than 1% in August. And we are hoping and we are shooting for inflation to fall around 1.5% by the end of the year. 1.5% already at the end of the year is more or less around the target that we've got for next year, which is 17% per annum. So essentially what we're saying is that by the turning of the year, we will most likely be already hitting inside or at least in the boundary of the inflation target band that we had set for the central bank to comply with. Growth-wise, we've took office with the economy already falling. It fell even more so in the first half of the year as we were fixing the mess. But the numbers that we've got for the third quarter of this year are showing us that not only the economy stopped falling, but most likely there might have been some, incipient positive increase in those figures, which is also what we were expecting. This time we were expecting it for the fourth quarter of the year, and it's happened apparently a quarter ahead of what we expected. Tip for any of you guys who are thinking about eventually holding a public job in your countries, it makes a lot of difference if you can promise what you can deliver, and once you deliver it, your credibility being on the line, it gives you a much more space and much more room for policy making. Credibility is like the matter around which you build your policies. You learn about many policy tools in university. I'm not aware that they tell you enough about credibility. The fact that makes these policies work more than anything else is not so much brain, but rather the fact that other people believe in what you're doing. And for that, it's very important that you deliver on your promises. And that's probably the trademark of the Macri administration. We are very realistic about our program, about our projects, about our targets, because we know all too well that meeting the targets, it's all it takes for the sequencing to be right and for the targets to be met, basically. This is probably the final thought, or the next to final thought. Public opinion. I mentioned that change is not about this administration, is about our boss, which is the Argentine people. This is how the Argentine people felt over the last 8 years or so, since 2006 onwards. The red line there is, this is an opinion poll nationwide. The red line is the personal or the current situation. When people polled are asked, well, how do you feel about your personal finances today? The blue line is, how do you feel about the future? And one of the distinctive characteristics of populism, as we know it, is that you spend a lot more effort on the present situation than on the future. It's about discounting rate, for those of you who've taken a course on that, which is basically 0. I mean, you put the same weight or even more weight on the present than on the future. And the Argentine people seem to have understood that pretty well, because throughout the Kirchner years, they were happier about the current situation than they were about the future prospects. They knew all too well that that was their opportunity to spend whatever they had to spend, because they were basically, the Kirchners were forcing you into spending even what you didn't want to spend on. When we took office, we've got the exact opposite situation. The current expectation element has fallen alongside with the recession. We're not surprised about that, but we are pleasantly surprised about the fact that, I don't know, it's green or blue. It looks blue in my screen here, but it might be green in yours. Yeah, it should be green, because it's that's the whole point about it, isn't it? So we've never seen such a significant gap between the hope and the present. And this is also a trademark of our administration. We're always catering to the Argentines, who are this nation of people which, compared to the rest of the world, as President Macri has said again and again, there's probably no other country in the world where the gap between where we are and where we could be is this high. We know the potential that we've got. We know that, historically, governments in Argentina have been basically frustrating those expectations and disappointing that potential. But that potential and that hope is basically intact. And this also tells you a lot about the maturity of our boss's decision, the public and the people of Argentina. They knew all too well that the previous system was unsustainable. They called for change even before the crisis. They asked us to avert the crisis, and they understand all too well that there's a transition period where things will not look great for a while, but in as much as they see that things are changing, they're willing to support what we're doing. And I think that's probably the most important thing that you should take away, as I mentioned at the beginning, from Argentina. We were so surprised that some of the bills that we sent to Congress were rather easily approved. It was probably, as much as we'd like to believe that it was our masterminding of the political situation, it was a lot more about public opinion letting the opposition know that this was the right way to go. And that's why we were able to approve some important legislation. And this is what makes us confident that into the midterm elections of next year, in as much as we continue to deliver on our promises, we will be able to keep the ball rolling. And keep the ball rolling means that the probabilities that this turnaround is different are going to be increasing. So rather than looking at us, I think you should be looking at the Argentine people, who so far have been much, much wiser than anyone in the administration, as it's been shown. Wrapping up then, I don't know what that verb is. Anyway, you know what we're doing, so I don't need to explain that. We're basically fixing the mess, or tidying up the mess. That's what it is. By establishing macroeconomic consistency At the same time, we're caring for the poor. We've spent significant fiscal resources to cater to the most vulnerable this year, north of 1 point of GDP. Warn you, we didn't have that fiscal space. We found it because we thought that it was critical, not just from a moral point of view, but also from a sustainability point of view, that we were able to achieve that. We increased some social programs. We extended some benefits for the poor, and that's allowed for, the unwanted consequences of some of the measures that we've taken to be alleviated when it comes to the lower end of the population. Restoring credibility is probably the most you've seen so far of our administration. This is where we get awards internationally. But there's one reason why we do that, because we believe that only by restoring credibility, only by being credible, only by creating the conditions for not just foreign but also local investment to thrive in our country, this will bring the jobs, and these jobs will allow us to march gradually but consistently towards the number one target of the Macri administration, which is ending poverty, and which is the pin that I'm wearing on my suit today. Thank you very much.
Well, in the first place, I'd like to thank the Minister for a very clear exposition of the challenges that the administration faced and recent developments. I couldn't agree more with him. The credibility for any program, and in particular for Argentina, is a central factor. In fact, we were preaching to the converted, because that's what we do at PEPEM. Spend a great deal of time talking about credibility and showing different models where that works out. So at least there is theory. And I'm very glad to see that you agree that facts are also kind of confirming the validity of that point of view. And let me elaborate a little bit of that, because I think that's very important. That's how you put it, and I agree. I mean, you said something which is, credibility is something that is very hard to build. And it comes from the public. So no matter how big your reputation is as an economist or political scientist or whatever, if the people don't believe, then you don't have much of a future. So I think that the government has been, in a sense, very fortunate to follow a sequencing that was able to bring people into the fray, so to say, and also kind of fortunate that the previous administration seemed to have done everything possible for you guys to look really quite effective.
The bar was low, wasn't it?
The what?
The bar was very low.
Well, that's one way of putting it. So the combination is fine, and now there is some evidence we were discussing in the breakfast, for example, that Argentina has been able to place a bond, 5-year bond, in pesos at 18%. In pesos, which is about the
5-year.
5-year bond. Yeah, 5-year bond. Did I say that? Sorry, 5-year. That's a good point. It's 5 years. While at the same time, the central bank is now floating bonds at close to 30%. So here you have the present and the future again. It is the same, it's a different way of looking at the picture. Investors, presumably, who are coming now are demanding, say, around 30%. But investors who look at the future are prepared to take a bond for 18%. That's quite remarkable. I think that should not be missed. So I'm very convinced that the government has been able to really establish its credential momentarily, and that's very hopeful. Now, why do I think that this is important? And now I will ask some pointed questions because I don't want to monopolize this. Why it is important? Because the transition is not easy. Here we have an economy that is trying to stop inflation with a still large fiscal deficit. And we know that if you don't manage that well, it can blow up. Because we know we have many examples. And Argentina is one of those. So we have plenty of situations where not being able to rein in the fiscal deficit was a problem. But so you have a space, and in order to be able to use the space, once again, credibility, optimism on the part of the public is very important. So I have now some pointed, more precise questions and about the transition. One concern that you hear quite often in these forums is about the provinces in Argentina. We have a difficult relationship between the central government and the provinces have been kind of the engine in the past of inflation. So my question is the government trying to rein in keep a rein on fiscal, on provincial policies debt? One question. Another question is that Argentina is a low savings economy. And that's a problem. It probably has to do with the lack of development of the financial sector. But it's a fact momentarily. So that if Argentina is going to grow beyond the next year on a sustainable basis, investment is of the essence. And that will probably require foreign investors. And again, credibility comes in. But I have two specific questions around that. So how to do that? One can think of incentives, fiscal incentives, which are costly. But they need not be given to all the investment projects, all the capital that is already installed, but to new capital. So you can have a differentiated taxation. Is that in the cards? Second is, comes up all the time, and again has to do with credibility. The problem with investment, though, is that the investment that we care about from a sustainable growth perspective is long-term investment, that just not 1 year. We have to really have credibility for several. Once again, having this 5-year bond is a very good signal. But one thing that comes up all the time is regulatory uncertainty. Argentina, unfortunately, has a tradition. The previous administration, when they came up, said, I'm raising taxes on these guys because they gained so much money in the past. Well, if you run an economy like that, imagine going to a casino where the tax that they will charge you when you leave depends on how successful you were at the roulette. So that's something that is very high in investors' minds. And related to that, there is this project, this arrangement called PPP, Private-Public Partnership, which are an attempt to reduce some of that by bringing in other investors, the IFC, for example, that will help to reassure the private sector's investors that they will not be, the rules are not going to be changed in the future. A couple of other things, and then I finish more precisely. I hear, I don't know, reading the news, the central bank saying we have been lowering the interest rate, and however, I don't see that being transmitted to the banking sector. It's a general complaint about banks. I'm not saying that they are guilty, but maybe as a result of history, banks are reluctant to lend. By the way, not only in Argentina, nowadays in Europe, and I'm sure that David will bring that up, but that's what the problem that the ECB has. You know that presently the ECB is lending directly to corporations because they don't trust the banks. So we are living in a world where banks are becoming a nuisance, or a place where you live is it's a vault where the money is kept. But they are not very effective about that. Now, in the case of Argentina, we have Banco Nación. We can have public banks. What is the role of public banks for this? I mean, assuming that that Argentina doesn't have a really working, lively banking sector. And also, with this I finish, and related to that is whether there is room for tax incentives for banks to lend. I don't know if that would be under the control of the central bank or the Minister of Finance. So these are my questions. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Getting really good at muting this when I need to mute it. But thank you, Guillermo. Let me go over some of your, not just questions, and the questions were very good, but the thoughts as well. And I knew I was preaching to the choir, of course, because I read some of your papers. That was my trick. But about credibility. And it's good that you point out the fact that you were able to issue 5-year bonds in pesos, which is something we've done. That was the first issue ever in pesos in Argentina. You compare to other countries in the region which have done this very successfully, like Peru, Chile, of course, Colombia, Mexico. It took them a while after their own problem or crisis or whatever to tap into the local market and to be able to issue in the local currency. In fact, if I remember correctly, Guillermo, it took Mexico more than 5 years to issue in pesos after the tequila crisis. So it's a very encouraging news that this is what's happening right now. And that particular news speaks to some of the questions that you brought up. For instance, starting with the very last one about interest rates and bank lending. It's very important for the banks to have a benchmark around which they can price their lending, because the best excuse so far for not moving out the curve and lend to small and medium-sized companies at reasonable peso-denominated rates was because it was too uncertain. Well, not anymore. There's a benchmark around which they can price that. And therefore, we believe that in your very good characterization of which interest rate is more important for the economy, the central bank short-run rate or the medium-run market rate that we are securing through the Treasury's bond issuance, I've got no doubt that the latter is more important. So this also speaks to developing the local market, which is something you were touching upon with the comment about low savings economy. It is indeed a small capital market. I think that's the flip side of the institutional problems that we've had over the last few years. This is where we believe the tax amnesty exercise that we're going through right now will make a difference. In the following sense, we know all too well that it's not that the savings rate is low, but rather that most of those savings are not, being put at work in the local financial system. And the tax amnesty exercise has that element to it. We're not incentivizing capital repatriation. We are happy enough with taxpayers to start paying the taxes that they've forgotten to pay over the last few years. We're very happy to open the door to them. But once the door is closed, we'll be looking through the window, so to speak. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity because the fence is closing in, the international fence is closing in, given that Argentina has signed a significant amount of tax treaties with other fiscal administrations, such that from January onwards we'll have the capacity of exchanging information automatically with more than 50 jurisdictions around the world and more than 100 by 2018. And the thing about those savings that are sitting somewhere, in as much as they're not declared, they're not put to work. The whole point of those savers is to keep those savings under the radar screen. So it's almost impossible for them, even if they believed in the opportunities Argentina is offering now, to put them at work. This is the first step towards opening up a new menu for those savings that we know all too well that are there and that will be eventually available for the capital market. So you were asking about taxation both when you spoke about the capital market and when you spoke about bank lending. And the answer to that is most likely not. When it comes to bank lending, I don't know about any other activity in the world where you need to be incentivized to do what you ought to do anyways. It would be so odd to give banks a tax incentive to lend, given that they've got to lend to make ends meet. So I think it's more about uncertainty, it's more about laying the groundworks, and it's more about the banks being aware that it's in their best interest to lend. And of course that's the case of public banks as well, but with one caveat. And public banks have also been milked by the previous administration. So it's going to take a while for them to put their own house in order. And we are actually contributing ourselves from the Treasury in that regard. Up until last year, you mentioned Banco Nación. Banco Nación was pretty much the lender of first resort to the Treasury. Neck to neck with the central bank, of course. We stop those two avenues of lending. We want to have a strong Banco Nación such that Banco Nación can do what its charter says, which is lend to small and medium-sized companies. And this is another side effect of our financial policies, if you will. Provinces, you've all the reasons to worry about because in the past, provincial deficits were part of the problem. To be fair, their deficit is actually smaller than our deficit. So the starting point is not that bad on their side, but I'm sure you are pointing out to what some other investors are pointing out, that one thing is a starting point, a different thing is a trend. And essentially what we're trying to do with the provinces is to deal with that trend such that it doesn't, go overboard. And in fact, you might
see that as early as in the current budget discussion that's going through Congress, we'll be able to include a few articles that we are negotiating with the provinces to the idea of bringing current spending and provincial fiscal deficits in line with our own targets. And the trick there is that if provinces do not do that, then they will not be able to apply for the central government's approval for access to the market. So there is an incentive-compatible scheme there that we are starting to work on right now. And it takes part of the budget discussion, but hopefully we'll be able to make some inroads in that one. PPP, PPP has already been approved in the Senate, a PPP law. It's critical for us because, as you rightly say, Guillermo, the flip side of low savings put at work by Argentines in Argentina is a very low investment rate. The investment rate last year was less than 16% of GDP. Countries don't grow out of, such a low investment rate. We need to increase that rate from 16 to at least 23, 24. We're talking about 8 points worth of GDP that need to be, invested in addition to what's being invested right now. We don't have the fiscal space to do all of that investment, even if we've got a very ambitious infrastructure program for the next few years. So we count on the private sector to get more involved in that avenue as well. And I would argue not only do we count on the private sector, we need the private sector to make sure that capital spending for public goods is as transparent as possible. One of the very sad, legacies of the previous administration is that they were just, stealing the lives out of public spending. So we need to be very careful about that. It's a lot more difficult to get a bribe if through PPP the only thing you do as a public official is to pay off what you owe once the private sector has actually completed the hospital, the school, the road, or the whatever they're going through. So we're very excited about the prospects of PPP. We've worked with some other countries that have done it before. We've learned about the mistakes or the things that didn't actually work for them. So we count a lot on the PPP. Of course, another issue that you raise, regulatory uncertainty, how to deal with it. We are very aware of that, but this is where your first point about credibility comes into play. It's something that we will be able to earn gradually as we move along. We are very careful not to rock the regulatory boat, if you will, and we're very careful about making sure that people understand that even if our program is a gradual program, there's a very clear north where we're going to, and there's a very clear south where we are not going to. So in that regard, I think your point is very well taken. It's a matter of time, and throughout that time, it's very important that we are consistent about the changes that we make. And I think that probably covers your main concerns. But I'll finish up with one thought that you brought to the table. You said transition is not easy. And we know that all too well. And it's very important for everyone to know that that's the case, because sometimes it looks as if, we had one or two home runs, and therefore, people will think, okay, they can master everything. Or even our own people, our own people in the team would think, well, it's that easy. No, it's not easy. Transitions are not easy. This transition in particular is certainly not easy. That's the reason why when we set up our targets, some people thought they were not ambitious enough. Most of those who thought they were not ambitious enough are now understanding that they are indeed very ambitious, given the circumstances. And that, I think, it's giving us also credibility points in the sense that we make a case of being as realistic as possible as we move ahead. And in fact, the very budget that is being discussed right now in Congress is the first such budget in probably 10 years, in the sense that the budget is not trying to cheat the people and the lawmakers, but rather it's a budget that is predicated upon real figures, trustworthy numbers, and realistic projections as we move ahead. Someone was asking us this morning in our breakfast that we had, well, next year is election year, so what's going to happen with the budget? And what's going to happen with the budget is what we put in the budget. And the budget already takes into account, we're not going to be surprised by the fact that we've got elections next year. So the budget already takes into account the fact that we actually have elections next year. I know sometimes this is hard for some people to understand, but believe us, I mean, that is actually what we're trying to do. And the reason why we do it is precisely of what Guillermo mentioned and what I mentioned. Credibility is key here, and this is the sacred value the president is always pushing us to keep. Don't go overboard and don't overpromise if you're not going to overachieve. And I think as much as we can keep that and as much as we can cater that to the population, as I mentioned in the beginning, this turnaround is going to be truly for real.
Thank you, Trish. First of all, I'd like to say how grateful I am, we at OMFIF, to be here with you, Trish, and SIPA. We've been talking about some kind of collaboration for some time, and now we're starting, and I'm really sure it's going to go on and be very successful. OMFIF is a platform for dialogue set up in London, but with something of a global footprint, and we bring together people from the public and the private policy area and financial markets, and we're looking forward to working with you. I
happen to be the guinea pig of this association.
Well, I would say more than that. I would say you're the guinea dragon. It's flying high on Columbus Day. And I was really struck by your speech, Alfonso, and I would just like to make a couple of points and then ask two quick questions. I was struck, first of all, by the fact that you have drawn, obviously, not only on the works of Guillermo, his papers and so on in credibility, but also seems to be at least a touch of Machiavellism in there. And I like this mix between the shock therapy and the gradualism. I also like this carrot and stick. I like the metaphor of the fences closing in on the malfeasance abroad and the window being open. It reminds me a bit of one of those Harrison Ford films, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you have the stones of the museum drawing in, and the devilish person who's trying to avoid his taxi is trying to crawl out, and he knows that the sides of that monument are closing in on him. So I enjoyed that very much indeed. I also like the way that you are calling on the people. You are no longer populist, it seems, but you are very much guided by the people. And I think that's something we all need to bear in mind, this humility of being elected and having to serve the people. And you mentioned that several times in the course of your statement. So a couple of questions coming out of that. One, I'm also just dismayed by the situation in Europe that we have at the moment with a country like Greece, which, like yours, has a long and noble history with ups and downs. And the Greek people are a great people. They want to get back to being a great people. They're obviously not doing it very well at the moment. You seem to be able to draw on a residue of patriotism. I hope this amnesty works. There's a diaspora. I'm absolutely sure if Greece were to call in an amnesty, then the money would stay out there. It probably would leave in even greater numbers. But you seem to be able to benefit from an undertone, a reservoir of great patriotism about people who really care about their country and want to make it great again, or at least bring it back to where it was, say, before the Second World War, in terms of being a really important economic power. Is this really a great strength of the Argentinian people that you could call upon in this difficult time, and to what extent, in a very concrete way, will you be doing this? Clearly, in contrast to Greece, you've got your own currency, which makes a big difference, but there may be other issues as well that you'd like to highlight. And then the second point is you are clearly going to have to need a lot of foreign investment. You stressed the point about credibility. You've got to make promises that you can keep your feet on the ground, deliver. That was a strong message. What role will China play in all this? Because we know China is very interested in developing energy resources throughout Latin America. Big push going on by the Chinese to diversify their reserves. SAFE, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, has set up a big fund for Latin America. They're coming your way if they're not there already. There are some feelings in some parts of the emerging markets that there's too much China, because they may be trying to seek too much influence. On the other hand, if they're investing, why not take their money and work with them in a very constructive way? So I'd like to have your feeling about what is the balance about how China will be helping you to make a difference in Argentina.
Thank you, David. I mean, these are two very, very good and very challenging questions. Let me start by the China one. China's been investing in Argentina for a number of years now. And we welcome that investment. And we have a view that if you believe in globalization, then you can't disregard China, because China is here to stay. So China is going to be an even more important or increasingly important player in the world, in the international financial world, that is. And we've seen that statement being made graphically and very powerfully through their hosting of the G20 exercise this year. They do want to do it. They also are looking for credibility points. They have just now gained access to the SDR basket. You know that? This is the IMF basket of currencies that for the first time ever includes a non-developed market currency in its basket, which is already quite an acknowledgement of China's role. China's been participating even before the SAFE fund through some complicated financial instruments with funding to different central banks around the world, not just in Latin America, but also elsewhere in the world. Australia is one of them, for instance. And we want to keep those funds and that capability working to our benefit as well. So essentially what we've done so far with China is we've taken some time to look into the small print of some of the things that had been signed with the previous administration. And we've found a lot of collaboration from the Chinese authorities to change whatever both parties thought we had to change and to keep the flow going. So in that regard, I think China is a critical player, and China is a relationship that we want to keep, just as with any other important relationship, including the ones that we've lost for a number of years and now we're regaining. I use the opportunity to let the audience know that so far this year we've received high-level visits from countries that we had not received in maybe 15 years. Like we had President Obama, we had Matteo Renzi from Italy, and we had Hollande from France. I don't want to forget any other, but we've got quite a few mandatories from usually friendly nations that didn't bother to come over for more than a decade
I think you even had a British minister, didn't you? Because we had a little local difficulty with you a few years ago, but that's all part of the past now.
But now that you mention it, yeah. And not only that, I mean, President Macri has met with every single G7 leader, either at home or in different fora, including, of course, Theresa May at the United Nations situation, but I won't get into that. Patriotism. That's a very good question. In fact, I'm not sure I can answer that question because it's way beyond what I can offer as a response. I don't dare to compare with Greece. I don't know enough about Greece. I think all I'm saying is that in as much as Argentines realize that this is it, that this is either a turning point or, I don't know what adjective to use for the alternative point, if you will. I think there are very good chances that many Argentines see this opportunity as the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to help and to collaborate. We're seeing that, a lot of that already on the human capital side. I've got 2 people on my team here today that we were able to bring over from the States, either from academics or from the private sector. They are taking a risk, of course, but there are many others like Vladimir and Patricia who've made this call. I want to be there because this is it. So the human capital element of patriotism is actually coming along. I think that through the tax amnesty and through I liked it so much the way you put it. Your metaphor was so much better.
No, I was using your metaphor. Yeah.
I think that would also help to do the click on the capital or the physical or the financial, if you will, capital side of the ledger. But it's not like we are calling the hearts to join in. We're just, it's not, I hope it's not Machiavelli, but rather real politics. And as I said before, we are for real. We promise what we can deliver on, and we do our best to deliver. And that mantra, as we repeat that, and that happens, I think that will essentially spark the fire of patriotism throughout the areas that it needs to be sparked.
Okay, I know a few folks had to go off to class, but for those of you who can stay, let's take a few minutes for questions. We do have a mic. We do have a mic. Okay, so obviously, we always love it when students ask questions. That's sort of a treat, and I know that's something that the minister is particularly interested in. So would you please identify yourself and your affiliation as well? I think there were 2 hands here and then over here.
Hi, Juan Navarro-Staikos. I'm not a student, but I hope I can still ask a question.
Yeah.
I work at OMFIF Capital Markets and on the global macro team. Thank you, Minister. That was a very good presentation. We're all very happy with the change. But you did inherit a difficult situation. And the difficult situation, like in many previous instances in Argentina, is a fiscal challenge. You put in place a plan. You started raising utility rates and removing some of these distortionary subsidies. And those are those red bars that were the positive red bars throughout the year. But then at the end, there's a negative red bar, which is the unwinding of your plan because of the Supreme Court decision. So this is hard. And I wanted to get your sense of how can you ensure that your plan, which is an ambitious plan, it's a good plan, you're rebalancing the economy, but there's a lot going against it. The Supreme Court, there's political pressures going against it. How can you ensure that your reforms in the next 4 years are successful? Thank you.
Why don't we get 2 questions?
Hi, I'm Lucy with LaRouche. So, as you mentioned a bit yourself, in Argentina, inflation is skyrocketing, rocketing, people are losing jobs, can't pay these bills that have at least tripled, And even because of all these mass strikes everywhere, Wall Street Journal has questioned whether Marsh can keep his position. Argentina has not received the promised investments from outside, and that's also not going to happen because the transatlantic financial system run by Wall Street and City of London is right now threatened to collapse, triggered by the collapse of Deutsche Bank that has a $75 trillion derivatives debt. And this could trigger, an overall collapse of the transatlantic financial system, much worse than 2008. So the only prospects for a brighter future is actually with China, who has freed 700 million people from poverty and has committed themselves to the G20 to end world poverty. And now we're seeing that Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, as an example, are looking towards China, and now you have this commitment for building the transcontinental high-speed railway as just one part of the whole emerging BRICS paradigm of building nuclear power plants, high-speed rail, all these development projects. So my question to you is, if you think you're representing the Argentine population, in which case, with what I just brought up, you should really go back to this BRICS agenda, like what Christina was actually doing, participating in the BRICS agenda, or like others in the past, if you are loyal to the British Queen and are intending to oversee the demise of Argentina as punishment for participating in the BRICS process and claiming sovereignty for British Empire.
I'm terribly sorry to disappoint you. The British are just not that clever to do what you're trying to say. I think you can read about that in novels, but not in real life.
Let me start with the second one. Essentially, there were elections last year, and in those elections, the previous regime, which is pretty much what you referred to at the end of your thoughts, was defeated, and the people of Argentina decided to change. And they decided that we were the ones who were going to deliver the change. And I think we should all be very respectful of the fact that the people of Argentina have actually decided that. And we are doing our best to deliver on that mandate and on that promise. As I explained before, I don't think our only hope is China. I think China is part of the equation, but it's not our only hope. I don't think the BRICS agenda, I don't think there is a BRICS agenda to start with. There was one, but it's not there to be seen anymore. And we've got a program, and that program will be tested in the elections next year. And the people of Argentina will decide next year if we are meeting our promises and that we are or we are not delivering on the change that the people of Argentina decided upon. I don't think there's any connection with Deutsche Bank or any of the like. I think it's much simpler. This is about a population that took the brave decision of putting populism behind. And I think we need to explain to the world that populism is not the way forward. Not because we believe in it, but rather because our people has actually told us not to. And I think that's a lesson that many countries in the world could take, in fact. I won't mention which countries, but you can imagine which as well. So in that regard, all we're saying is we are taking the heed of what our boss has asked us to do, which is change. Change that is sustainable, change that is caring for the most in need, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're not trying to do anything else than that, and we're happy if we can achieve that.
Then the conspiracy theories and all that, we'll leave it for people like David, for instance, who used to be a journalist, or for writers, or for, I don't know, romantics.
Journalists keep their feet pretty much on the ground these days.
Do they? Yeah. Well, on the first question, subsidies, there was something along the lines of how do you ensure that it actually comes true, something like that. This was the one area where we had to accommodate our original program, and for us, it's still a learning process. You know, we are still learning from that experience. But I believe that that the outcome is actually might end up being actually better than what we had expected. It was almost as if we had to go through this how do you call it, delay, to make the whole change more robust. Because now there's a sentence from the Supreme Court, which, by the way, we did not challenge. The previous administration, I don't know if within the BRIC charter or wherein, but the previous administration was very good at A, challenging sentences from the Supreme Court, and more importantly, B, not abiding to them, which is another thing we've been able to do. I mean, for a number of years, a populist administration like the Kirchners thought it was a very good idea not to pay their debts with the pensioners, just to wait for them to literally pass away and save some pennies. We flipped that around and we said, well, we're going to take heed of a sentence of the Supreme Court, this rule of law. It's very important that we do it. We're spending a significant amount of fiscal resources to do that next year, but we think that's the divide between the previous regime and the current one. And when it comes to the subsidy thing, same thing. We went back to the drawing board. The Supreme Court told us, well, not too fast. Make sure it's gradual. But make sure you eventually converge towards market pricing, because that's what the law says in this particular case. So in a way, yes, the Supreme Court told us to go slowly, but also at the same time, they told us to just move ahead and plow ahead. So we think this, whatever decision we take now onwards, which we are taking, is going to be more robust, legally and also socially, than it would have been otherwise. And in fact, this is also a sea change with the previous administration. The previous administration tried to, at some point, to rein in the absurd subsidy system. And they were not able to. And to the extent that they did, they were going against Supreme Court rulings and not in favor of Supreme Court rulings. The subsidy thing is a significant element of our fiscal program. And therefore, it's so important for us that whatever we do there, it turns out to be robust. And just for the rest of the audience, for the benefit of the rest of the audience, what we're trying to do there is to cut subsidies to the extent that we no longer subsidize the rich. Another great idea of the previous regime, which we thought it was good not to have it anymore. And this was also something that our people, the Argentine people, voted for. Stop subsidizing the rich. So this is, if you will, the critical element of the discussion. And in that regard, the Supreme Court was also very clear about worry not about the rich, worry about the poor. And make sure you instill and you institutionalize the social tariff, which, by the way, the previous administration didn't have, and which this administration will have and is intending to keep for as many years as possible.
A couple more questions. Again, if you could identify yourself and your affiliates.
Thank you. My name is George. I'm a dual degree student, MBA. I'm here at SIPA. And my question is about the Mercosur. I'm wondering, what do you see for the future of Mercosur and the role that Mercosur will have in Argentinians' plans for trade agreements? And given that today's policies of Argentina are more likely to be similar to the countries of the Pacific Alliance than they are from the Mercosur, should we see, is it possible to think of Argentina coming closer to those 4 countries integrating the Pacific Alliance? Thank you.
Thank you, George. Shall I?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me start from, let me make a very clear point about the Pacific Alliance, which is the following. We, Argentina, already have a special trade agreement, we call them ACE, for the Spanish acronym, with each one of the 4 members of the Pacific Alliance. And those agreements are allowed within the Mercosur platform. There are exceptions to Mercosur, and these are 4 exceptions that are allowed within the framework of Mercosur. And they are such that if we flipped around and moved into Alianza del Pacífico for whatever reason, pretty much nothing would change, because we already had the agreements with every single participant or member of the Alianza del Pacífico. So that would not be the right way of looking at it. Secondly, our destiny is with and within Mercosur. We are very clear about that. There's no realistic way to think that Argentina can integrate with the rest of the world, given our back to Brazil. It's not going to happen that way. Brazil is our main trade partner. We've got significant ties with Brazil beyond trade. We want that relationship to grow rather than to fade. And this is actually what we're working on right now. You know that there's also Uruguay and Paraguay. There are some issues with Venezuela right now, being a member of Mercosur, who's so far been able to afford not complying with almost any treaty within Mercosur. So that's the only thing we're raising with Venezuela. We want the people of Venezuela to be in, but we'd very much like the government of Venezuela to comply to at least one of the treaties that we've all signed and we are complying with. So within Mercosur, this is probably the first time since its inception that we are in a position to really coordinate our macroeconomic policies, because up until now, they were, when we had a floating regime, Brazil had a fixed regime, or the other way around, or Uruguay, Paraguay. This time around, we've got the beautiful opportunity to start coordinating our macroeconomic policies in a way we've never had the opportunity to do so. We just had a state visit from President Temer and his cabinet in Buenos Aires. There are ongoing negotiations with Brazil. We also have the ongoing negotiation between Mercosur and the European Union. And we are even open to discussions with Great Britain outside of the European Union, but within Mercosur. So essentially the thought here is that we need to do a lot more of regional integration than we've done so far. I think Mercosur so far has been a great idea and a lot of goodwill, but we need to turn that goodwill into action and to integrate our economies truly as they need to be integrated. And that's not just trade. It's cultural integration, it is political integration, it is physical integration. One thing we're working with multilateral development banks is to devise infrastructure investment programs that will reconnect our regions and our countries in a way that so far has not happened. An example of that is a bridge that we are committing to with the Chileans that will cross the Andes between San Juan and Coquimbo, and that will eventually allow us, and probably the region as well, to connect the Atlantic with the Pacific. And this is where we think Argentina has a physical, as much as cultural and political role to play. Because when you look at Alianza del Pacífico and Mercosur, we can very well be the intersection between those two. And if we play that role, we can then hope for an integrated South America, something that from the days of Bolivar and San Martin has been eluding us ever since. So it's truly ambitious, but frankly there's no other way out.
Thank you. I'm really sorry, but I'm afraid that's all the time that we have. Thank you all very much for coming. Mr. Thank you.
Thank you so much.